he vanished from the Grand Canyon. 6 months later, climbers stumbled on a terrifying scene. The coffee cup sat cold and untouched on Daniel Reeves' kitchen table, steam long since evaporated into the Arizona morning air. His neighbors would later remember seeing him load his weathered backpack into his Jeep at dawn, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this 100 times before. But there was something different about Daniel that morning, something his friend Marcus couldn't quite put his finger on when they'd spoken the night before. "You sure you want to go alone, Dan?" Marcus had asked, concern creeping into his voice. "You've been different lately. Ever since you quit the bureau." Daniel had paused, his callous fingers drumming against the phone. "I need to clear my head, Marcus. 4 days in the canyon, just me and the silence. I'll be back Sunday." That was the last time anyone would hear Daniel Reeves' voice. At 42, Daniel was the kind of man who understood the desert's moods better than most people understood their own families. 15 years as an environmental inspector had taught him to read the land like a book. Every rock formation, every wind pattern, every subtle shift in the ecosystem told a story. His colleagues at the Bureau of Environmental Quality had always marveled at his ability to spot environmental violations that others missed entirely. But 3 weeks ago, Daniel had walked into his supervisor's office and placed his resignation letter on the desk without a word of explanation. When pressed, he'd only muttered something about moral conflicts and not being able to sleep at night anymore. His supervisor, Janet Hawkins, had been too shocked to ask the right questions. Daniel Reeve was their best inspector, methodical, honest, and absolutely incorruptible. His sudden departure left a hole in their department that couldn't be easily filled. The signs had been there, though. In the weeks leading up to his resignation, Daniel had become increasingly withdrawn. He'd stopped joining his colleagues for their Friday evening drinks at Murphy's Tavern. He'd started taking long lunch breaks, often seen sitting alone in his Jeep in remote parking lots, staring at files spread across his dashboard. Most tellingly, he'd begun carrying a small digital camera everywhere, photographing things that seemed utterly mundane to anyone watching: rock formations, trail markers, construction sites glimpsed from highway overpasses. Sarah Chin, a park ranger who'd worked with Daniel on several environmental assessments, had noticed his behavior during their last collaboration. They'd been surveying a proposed development site near the South Rim when Daniel had suddenly stopped walking, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. "You see that?" he'd asked, pointing toward what looked like a cluster of parked vehicles barely visible through the heat shimmer. Sarah had squinted but could make out nothing unusual. "Construction crews, probably. There's always something being built around here." Daniel had pulled out his camera and zoomed in, snapping several photos. "Construction crews don't usually work on weekends," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "And they definitely don't cover their equipment with tarps when it's not raining." He'd spent the rest of that day distracted, frequently checking his phone and scribbling notes in a small leather journal he'd started carrying. When Sarah asked him about it later, he'd simply said he was documenting inconsistencies, and changed the subject. The morning Daniel disappeared, he'd driven to one of the most remote access points in the Grand Canyon National Park, a barely marked trailhead that led into the backcountry where few tourists ever ventured. The ranger station log showed he'd signed in at 7:23 a.m., listing his intended route as Hermit Creek to Dripping Springs, solo 4-day circuit. He'd estimated his return for the following Sunday. When Sunday came and went without Daniel checking out, the Park Service initiated a standard search protocol. Ranger teams combed the marked trails, checked water sources, and swept the most commonly used camping areas. Search and rescue volunteers joined the effort, their voices echoing across the canyon as they called Daniel's name. But the Grand Canyon is a vast, unforgiving landscape that swallows people whole. With over 1.2 million acres of wilderness, much of it accessible only to the most experienced hikers, finding one missing person is like searching for a specific grain of sand on an endless beach. After 5 days of intensive searching, the official effort was scaled back. Daniel Reeve had simply vanished into the stone and silence of the canyon. The last person to see Daniel alive was Tommy Yazzie, a Navajo guide who'd been leading a small group of tourists along a rim trail that Saturday morning. Tommy later told investigators that he'd spotted a lone hiker moving through the canyon depths, too far away to identify but fitting Daniel's general description. The figure had been heading toward an area the locals called the Maze, a network of narrow slot canyons and hidden passages that even experienced guides approached with caution. Man was moving with purpose, Tommy had said, his weathered face creased with concern. Wasn't wandering around lost. He knew exactly where he was going. But where Daniel had been going, and why, remained mysteries that would haunt everyone who knew him. In the weeks following his disappearance, Daniel's abandoned house in Flagstaff became a silent monument to questions without answers. His mail piled up in the box. His Jeep sat in the impound lot where the Park Service had towed it after the search was called off. His former colleagues at the Bureau whispered among themselves, wondering if the stress of the job had finally gotten to him, if he'd simply walked into the wilderness to escape whatever demons had been chasing him. Only one person suspected there might be more to Daniel's disappearance than a tragic hiking accident. Marcus Rivera, Daniel's closest friend and a fellow environmental advocate, couldn't shake the feeling that his friend had been running from something, or someone. The Daniel he knew wouldn't have just vanished into the wilderness without a trace. Daniel was too careful, too methodical, too aware of the canyon's dangers to simply get lost. But Marcus kept his suspicions to himself. After all, what evidence did he have? Just the memory of Daniel's increasingly paranoid behavior, his cryptic comments about moral conflicts, and the way he'd looked over his shoulder that last night they'd spoken, as if he expected someone to be watching. The official report listed Daniel Reeve as a missing person, presumed deceased. Case closed. The vast indifference of the canyon had claimed another victim, and life in the small communities surrounding the Grand Canyon gradually returned to normal. But in the depths of the canyon, where the sun rarely penetrates and the wind carries secrets through stone corridors older than human memory, Daniel Reeve's story was far from over. Hidden in a place where only the most determined, or desperate, would ever think to look, the truth of his disappearance waited in the darkness, protected by silence and stone. The truth that would, 6 months later, emerge from the canyon like a ghost returning to settle old scores. 6 months after Daniel Reeve vanished into the canyon's depths, Lara Hoffman was questioning every decision that had led her to this moment. Sweat dripped from her forehead as she pressed her back against the rough sandstone wall, her climbing harness cutting into her thighs. 30 feet below, her climbing partner Miguel Santos called up encouragement, his voice barely audible over the wind whistling through the narrow ravine. "You've got this, Lara! Just 20 more feet to the anchor point!" Lara had been climbing for 3 years, but this route was pushing her limits. She and Miguel had discovered it 2 weeks ago in an obscure climbing forum, a newly documented side route through what the locals called Devil's Throat, a dry ravine that most hikers avoided. The forum post had been brief. Untouched 5.7 route, south-facing wall, minimal foot traffic. Perfect for those seeking solitude. Solitude was exactly what they'd found. In 2 days of climbing, they hadn't seen another soul. Miguel was the experienced one, a rock climbing instructor from Phoenix who'd been scaling canyon walls since he was 16. He'd convinced Lara to attempt this route as a way to build her confidence on longer, more challenging climbs. "Trust me," he'd said while studying the route description. "Sometimes the best adventures happen when you go where nobody else wants to." Now, as Lara carefully placed her next piece of protection into a crack in the rock, she wondered if Miguel's definition of adventure was slightly different from hers. The descent had been worse than the climb. The ravine they'd rappelled into was narrow and claustrophobic, with walls that seemed to close in as they descended. Ancient flash flood debris created a maze of boulders and fallen trees that made navigation treacherous. But it was at the bottom of this forgotten corner of the canyon that their real adventure began. Miguel had been coiling rope at the base of the cliff when he noticed something odd. A section of the ravine floor looked different, deliberately arranged rather than naturally settled. Large stones had been carefully placed to create what looked almost like a cairn, but bigger and more purposeful. "Hey, Lara!" He called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Come look at this." Lara had rappelled down to find Miguel crouched beside the stone arrangement, his brow furrowed in concentration. "This doesn't look natural," he said, running his hands over the rocks. "These stones were placed here by someone." They'd spent 20 minutes carefully moving the stones, working methodically to avoid disturbing the arrangement more than necessary. Beneath the rocks, wrapped in a tattered plastic tarp, was a military-style lockbox, the kind used by survivalists and preppers. The box was old, its olive green paint faded and streaked with rust, but the latches still worked. Inside, they found treasures that made no immediate sense: a leather-bound journal with pages swollen from moisture, several folded topographical maps covered in handwritten annotations, and most puzzling of all, a collection of photographs showing what appeared to be construction equipment, drilling rigs, excavators, and cement mixers, all covered with camouflage tarps. But it was the papers beneath the photos that made Lara's hands tremble as she read. Corporate letterhead from something called Canyon Heights Development LLC. Environmental impact reports with official-looking stamps. And most disturbing of all, what appeared to be financial records showing payments to various officials, including several names she recognized from locals. "Miguel," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the confined space. "Look at this." The final item in the box was a business card. "Daniel Reeve, Environmental Inspector, Bureau of Environmental Quality." Someone had written on the back in fading ink, "If something happens to me, this box contains everything. The resort project is built on lies. People will die if they don't know the truth." Miguel had gone pale as he read over her shoulder. "Daniel Reeve, wasn't that the guy who disappeared 6 months ago? The hiker they never found?" Lara nodded, remembering the news coverage. The story had been everywhere for weeks. Experienced environmental inspector vanishes in Grand Canyon, massive search effort finds nothing. She'd felt sorry for his family, imagining the pain of never knowing what happened to someone you loved. But now, holding his journal in her hands, she realized Daniel Reeve might not have simply gotten lost in the wilderness. He might have been hiding something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The journal's final entry was dated just 3 days before Daniel's disappearance. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic. "They know I have the evidence. Followed me to the grocery store yesterday. Can't trust anyone at the bureau. Too many people have been bought off. If you're reading this, I didn't make it out. The Canyon Heights project is scheduled to break ground next month. The geological surveys are falsified. The drilling will destabilize the entire ridge system. They're building a luxury resort on top of a disaster waiting to happen." At the bottom of the page, in letters that seemed to jump off the paper, "If you're reading this, I didn't make it out." Miguel and Lara sat in stunned silence as the implications sank in. They'd come to the canyon looking for a challenging climb and had instead stumbled into what appeared to be a conspiracy that had cost a man his life. "We have to take this to the authorities," Lara said finally, her voice steady despite the fear growing in her chest. Miguel nodded, but as he looked up at the narrow strip of sky visible between the canyon walls, he couldn't shake the feeling that they just stepped into something much bigger and more dangerous than either of them was prepared to handle. Neither of them noticed the glint of sunlight reflecting off binoculars positioned on the rim high above them. The South Rim Ranger Station buzzed with its usual afternoon activity when Lara and Miguel walked through the door, Daniel's lockbox tucked securely in Lara's climbing pack. After their discovery in the ravine, they'd spent 2 hours hiking out, barely speaking as the weight of what they'd found settled over them like a heavy blanket. Ranger Beth Martinez looked up from her paperwork as they approached the front desk. A 20-year veteran of the Park Service, Beth had seen everything: tourists who'd gotten lost, climbers who'd pushed their limits too far, and families desperate for news about missing loved ones. But something about the expression on these 2 climbers' faces made her set down her pen and give them her full attention. "We found something in the canyon," Lara began, her voice tight with nervous energy. "Something that belonged to Daniel Reeve, the inspector who disappeared 6 months ago." Beth's expression shifted immediately. The Daniel Reeve case had haunted the Park Service for months. They'd thrown everything they had at the search: helicopters, specialized teams, even brought in tracking dogs. Finding nothing had been a professional failure that still stung. "What kind of something?" Beth asked, leaning forward. Miguel glanced around the busy ranger station, noting the other visitors and staff within earshot. "Maybe we should talk somewhere more private?" Beth led them to a small conference room where Lara carefully unpacked the lockbox. As she spread the contents across the table, the journal, the maps, the photographs of hidden construction equipment, Beth's face grew increasingly pale. "This is substantial," Beth said, picking up one of the photographs showing drilling equipment covered by camouflage tarps. "These photos show construction activity in areas that should be protected wilderness." But when Lara opened Daniel's journal to the final entry and read it aloud, Beth's reaction was strange. Instead of the shock and concern they'd expected, the ranger's face became carefully neutral, almost guarded. "Look, I appreciate you bringing this to us," Beth said, closing the journal with more force than necessary. "But you have to understand, people sometimes, well, they get paranoid about development projects. Daniel was under a lot of stress before he disappeared. His colleagues mentioned he'd been acting erratically." Lara exchanged a confused glance with Miguel. "But the photographs could be from anywhere," Beth interrupted. "Could be from years ago. Could be perfectly legal construction happening on private land." She began gathering the materials back into the lockbox with efficient movements. "I think you might be misunderstanding what you found here." The dismissive tone in Beth's voice sent alarm bells ringing in Miguel's head. This wasn't the reaction they'd expected from a park ranger confronted with evidence of illegal activity in her jurisdiction. "We'd like copies of everything," Lara said firmly. "For our own records." Beth hesitated for just a moment too long. "I'm afraid that's not possible. This is potential evidence in an ongoing missing person case. We'll need to keep everything for proper analysis." But Miguel had already pulled out his phone and quietly photographed several pages while Beth was speaking. The ranger noticed and her friendly demeanor cracked slightly. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to delete those photos. This is official park business now." "Is it?" Miguel asked, his voice taking on an edge. "Because it sounds like you're trying to cover something up." Beth's face flushed. "I think this meeting is over. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. We'll handle it from here." They left the ranger station feeling more confused and suspicious than when they'd arrived. Something was very wrong with Beth Martinez's reaction, and they both knew it. That night, they camped at Mather Campground, still processing what had happened. Miguel had managed to photograph not just the journal pages, but also several of the construction photos and the list of names Daniel had written in his notes. They'd spent the evening studying the images on his phone, trying to make sense of the connections Daniel had uncovered. It was just after midnight when Lara woke to the sound of someone moving around their campsite. She lay still in her sleeping bag, listening to the careful footsteps circling their tent. Miguel was awake too, she could tell by his breathing. The footsteps stopped directly outside their tent flap. Then silence. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the footsteps retreated. In the morning, they discovered their campsite had been thoroughly searched. Their backpacks had been rifled through, their climbing gear examined, and most tellingly, the photocopies they'd made of Daniel's journal, copies Beth Martinez hadn't known existed, were gone. When they tried to report the theft to the local police, they were passed from officer to officer until finally landing at the desk of Detective Ray Hoffman, who listened to their story with the kind of practiced patience that suggested he'd heard it all before. "Federal jurisdiction," he said finally, stamping their report with an official-looking seal. "Anything involving park land and missing persons gets handled by federal authorities. You'll be contacted by a construction safety officer who'll take your full statement." "Construction safety officer?" Lara asked. "What does construction have to do with a missing person case?" Detective Hoffman shrugged. "Above my pay grade, ma'am. But I'm sure they'll explain everything when they contact you." As they left the police station, Miguel grabbed Lara's arm. "We're in over our heads," he said quietly. "Whatever Daniel stumbled into, it's bigger than we thought. And now we're part of it. Lara nodded, her mind racing. The official brush-offs, the midnight search of their campsite, the convenient jurisdictional transfers, it all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. Daniel Reeve had been right about the conspiracy, and now they were targets too. Tom Bricker's house in Flagstaff looked like a library had exploded inside a coffee shop. Towers of newspapers, magazines, and research files covered every available surface, while the scent of dark roast and old paper created an atmosphere that spoke of countless late nights chasing stories that mattered. At 63, Tom had been retired from investigative journalism for 5 years, but his instincts were as sharp as ever. When Lara and Miguel showed up at his door with printouts of the photos Miguel had managed to capture on his phone, Tom's first reaction was suspicion. Too many cranks and conspiracy theorists had knocked on his door over the years, convinced they'd uncovered the story of the century. But as they spread the images across his cluttered dining room table, something in their earnest faces and the quality of the evidence made him pay attention. "Daniel Reeve," Tom said slowly, studying the final journal entry. "I remember the missing person case. Good man, from what I heard. Dedicated environmental inspector." He paused, his weathered fingers tracing the handwritten words. "But there's something I never told the investigators." Lara leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Tom disappeared into his home office and returned with a laptop covered in activist stickers from environmental organizations. His fingers moved across the keyboard with surprising speed for someone his age. 3 days before Daniel disappeared, I received this. He turned the screen toward them, revealing an encrypted email with a timestamp from 6 months ago. The subject line read, "Story that will change everything Dr." The message itself was brief but chilling. "Tom, remember the Riverside Dam story you broke in '98? This is bigger. Canyon Heights development isn't just cutting corners. They're building a resort on top of a geological disaster waiting to happen. I have proof of falsified safety reports, bribed inspectors, and geological surveys that were deliberately altered to hide fault lines and unstable rock formations. If something happens to me, look for the evidence in the canyon. I'm burying a complete copy of everything where only someone really looking would find it. The drilling they're doing is causing microfractures in the canyon wall. People are going to die if this gets built. I'll call you when I get back from my hike to set up a meeting. Trust no one else. Daniel." Miguel whistled softly. He knew he was in danger. "More than that," Tom said, his voice heavy with regret. "He was trying to do the right thing, and I was too slow to help him." He closed the laptop and stared out the window at the pine-covered hills surrounding Flagstaff. "I didn't see this email until 2 days after he'd already disappeared. I was covering a water rights dispute in Nevada, and I don't check my encrypted messages as often as I should anymore." Tom's voice cracked slightly. "By the time I got back and saw his message, the search teams were already calling off their efforts. I tried to tell the Park Service about the email, but they said it was just the paranoid ramblings of a man under stress. They'd already decided Daniel had gotten lost or had some kind of mental breakdown." Lara felt a chill run down her spine. "The evidence we found, it's exactly what he described. Photos of the hidden drilling, financial records showing bribes, geological reports that contradict each other. And now people are trying to silence us too," Miguel added, telling Tom about their encounters with Ranger Martinez and the local police, as well as the midnight search of their campsite. Tom nodded grimly. "That's how these things work. Environmental corruption at this level requires cooperation from multiple agencies. Park Service, local law enforcement, probably some federal officials too. The money involved in a luxury resort development can buy a lot of silence." He pulled out a thick file folder and spread its contents across the table alongside Daniel's evidence. "I've been investigating Canyon Heights development for months, ever since I got Daniel's email. What I've found corroborates everything in his journal." The documents Tom produced painted a picture of systematic corruption that made Daniel's discoveries look like just the tip of the iceberg. Canyon Heights development was owned by a shell company registered in Delaware, which was itself owned by a conglomerate with ties to several major hotel chains. The resort was designed to accommodate over 2,000 guests and would include a golf course, spa, and convention center built directly into the canyon rim. But here's the really terrifying part, Tom said, pointing to a geological survey from an independent firm that had been mysteriously withdrawn after its initial filing. This report, completed by a company that had no financial ties to the development, clearly shows that the proposed construction site sits on top of an unstable rock formation. The drilling for the foundation has been causing hairline fractures that extend deep into the canyon wall. Miguel studied the technical diagrams. What does that mean in practical terms? It means, Tom said quietly, that Daniel was right. The resort construction is literally undermining the structural integrity of that section of the canyon. With enough stress, from weather, seismic activity, or just the weight of the completed buildings, the entire development could collapse into the canyon, taking anyone inside with it. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They weren't just dealing with environmental violations or financial corruption. They were looking at evidence of a potential disaster that could finish hundreds of people. "We have to stop this," Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom nodded. "Daniel died trying to expose this. The least we can do is finish what he started." He began gathering the documents. "But we're going to need help. The kind of people who tried to silence Daniel, and who searched your campsite, don't give up easily. If we're going to take this public, we need to do it right." As if summoned by his words, Tom's phone buzzed with a news alert. He glanced at the screen and went pale. "What is it?" Miguel asked. Tom held up the phone, his hand shaking slightly. The headline read, "Section of New Canyon Heights Access Road Collapses into Fissure." Daniel's warnings were already coming true. The photograph on Tom's phone screen showed a scene that could have been lifted directly from Daniel Reeves' journal. A 50-foot section of the newly constructed Canyon Heights access road had simply vanished, leaving behind a jagged fissure that dropped into darkness. Emergency vehicles lined the remaining roadway like toys scattered by a giant hand, their flashing lights creating an eerie strobe effect in the desert twilight. Tom's fingers flew across his laptop keyboard, pulling up news feeds from 3 different local stations. Each report told the same shocking story. The road collapse had happened without warning at 3:47 p.m., just as a construction crew was heading home for the day. 5 workers had nearly driven into the fissure before realizing the road ahead had disappeared. "Look at this," Tom said, zooming in on one of the aerial photos. "The crack pattern. It matches exactly what Daniel drew in his journal 6 months ago." Laura leaned over his shoulder, comparing the news photos to Daniel's hand-drawn diagrams. The similarity was undeniable and terrifying. Daniel had predicted not just that the canyon would fail, but exactly how and where it would happen. Miguel was already on his phone, scrolling through social media feeds. "It's going viral," he said, his voice tight with excitement. "Someone posted drone footage on TikTok. The video has over 50,000 views already." But Tom's expression remained grim. "This is just the beginning. According to Daniel's calculations, this road collapse is a warning sign. The real catastrophe will be when the resort's main structure fails." As if to punctuate his words, Tom's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was familiar. Beth Martinez, the park ranger who had tried to dismiss their evidence just days earlier. "Mr. Bricker? This is Ranger Martinez from the South Rim Station. I need to speak with you and your friends immediately. There's been a development." Tom put the phone on speaker. "What kind of development, Ranger Martinez?" "The kind that means people are going to die if we don't act fast." Beth's voice was strained, almost desperate. "I can't talk over the phone. Meet me at the Bright Angel Lodge in 1 hour. Come alone, and bring everything you have about Daniel Reeve." The line went dead. Miguel looked skeptical. "It's a trap. She tried to cover this up 3 days ago, and now suddenly she wants to help?" But Tom was already reaching for his jacket. "Maybe. Or maybe seeing that road collapse into the canyon made her realize this is bigger than whatever they're paying her to keep quiet. An hour later, they sat in a corner booth at the Bright Angel Lodge restaurant, the dinner crowd providing cover for their conversation. Beth Martinez looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her ranger uniform was wrinkled, her usually neat hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail. "I need to start with an apology," she said without preamble. "When you brought me Daniel's evidence, I should have listened. Instead, I made a phone call I wish I could take back." "Who did you call?" Lara asked. "Canyon Heights Development has a liaison officer who works with the Park Service on environmental compliance. I was told that any discoveries related to their project should be reported immediately." Beth's hands shook as she lifted her coffee cup. "I thought I was following protocol. I didn't know." "Didn't know what?" Tom pressed. "That they would try to silence you. That they were willing to let people die to protect their investment." Beth pulled out a tablet and showed them internal Park Service communications. "After the road collapsed today, I started digging into things I should have investigated months ago. The Canyon Heights project has been fast-tracked through every regulatory approval process. Environmental impact studies that should have taken months were completed in weeks. Geological surveys that raised red flags were mysteriously replaced with more favorable reports." She swiped to another screen showing financial records. "And everyone who could have stopped the project has been bought off, transferred, or intimidated into silence. Including me." Miguel studied the documents. "What changed your mind?" "Two things," Beth said. "First, I found out that my own daughter's school is planning a field trip to tour the Canyon Heights construction site next month. 60 kids and their teachers, standing on top of what Daniel Reeve proved is an unstable cliff face." She paused, wiping tears from her eyes. "And second, I got a visit from the same people who searched your campsite. They made it very clear that my cooperation wasn't optional anymore." Tom leaned forward. "What do you need from us? Help me get this story out before more people die. I have access to internal Park Service communications, construction schedules, and safety reports that were never meant to see daylight. Combined with Daniel's evidence, we can prove that Canyon Heights Development has been operating with full knowledge that their project is a disaster waiting to happen." Lara felt a surge of hope mixed with determination. "How do we do this? The local media won't touch it, and the authorities are compromised." Tom smiled for the first time all day. "I may be retired, but I still have contacts. There's a podcast called Wild Truth that specializes in environmental exposés. They have over 2 million subscribers and a reputation for bulletproof fact-checking." Beth nodded eagerly. "I can provide official documentation to back up everything. Park Service emails, construction permits, geological reports, everything they need to make the story stick." As they planned their strategy, none of them noticed the man in the baseball cap sitting at the bar, apparently absorbed in the evening news but actually recording their entire conversation on his phone. By morning, their plan would be in motion, but so would the forces determined to stop them. The race to expose the truth about Canyon Heights Development was about to begin, and the stakes couldn't be higher. 3 weeks after the road collapse, the Wild Truth podcast episode titled "The Canyon Killer: How One Man's Evidence from Beyond the Grave Exposed a Deadly Conspiracy" had been downloaded over 5 million times. The episode featured Tom Bricker's carefully crafted narrative, supported by Beth Martinez's insider documentation and punctuated by readings from Daniel Reeve's journal that sent chills down listeners' spines. The impact was immediate and devastating. Within 48 hours of the episode's release, the FBI had opened a federal investigation into Canyon Heights Development. Within a week, construction on the resort had been halted pending a comprehensive geological survey by independent experts. The original survey that had approved the project was revealed to have been conducted by a company that had received over $2 million in consulting fees from Canyon Heights, money that federal investigators quickly discovered had been used to purchase luxury homes and exotic cars for the survey team's leadership. Lara watched the news coverage from her apartment in Phoenix, still hardly believing that their discovery in a remote canyon ravine had led to this moment. On her laptop screen, CNN was showing footage of FBI agents carrying boxes of evidence out of Canyon Heights Development's headquarters while the company's executives were led away in handcuffs. Miguel called just as the arrest footage began playing. "Are you watching this?" "Every channel," Lara replied, switching between news feeds. "They got Richard Caldwell." Richard Caldwell, the CEO of Canyon Heights Development, had been one of the names at the top of Daniel's list of suspected conspirators. His arrest at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, while attempting to board a private jet to the Cayman Islands, had been captured by airport security cameras and was now playing on repeat across every major news network. But it was the smaller arrests that felt most meaningful to Lara. James Morrison, the Bureau of Environmental Quality supervisor who had approved falsified geological reports. Patricia Vance, the Park Service regional director who had fast-tracked construction permits. Even Detective Ray Hoffman, who had dismissed their theft report and passed them off to the mysterious construction safety officer, who, it turned out, didn't exist. Tom's investigation, amplified by the podcast's massive reach, had exposed a network of corruption that reached into local, state, and federal agencies. The bribes Daniel had documented in his journal were just the beginning. Investigators had uncovered millions of dollars in illegal payments, forged documents, and intimidation tactics designed to silence anyone who questioned the Canyon Heights project. "The irony," Miguel said during their phone call, "is that if they just left Daniel alone, he probably would have filed his report, and it would have disappeared into some bureaucratic black hole. By finishing him, they guaranteed that his evidence would eventually come to light." Lara nodded, though Miguel couldn't see her. Daniel's journal had become more than just evidence. It had become a symbol of one person's courage in the face of overwhelming corruption. Environmental groups across the country were using #DanielReeve hashtags to demand stronger protections for whistleblowers. His story had inspired a new generation of activists who refused to be silenced by powerful interests. 6 months later, Lara found herself standing at a small ceremony in the Grand Canyon, surrounded by Daniel's family, former colleagues, and the small group of people who had helped bring his finishers to justice. The National Park Service was dedicating a plaque along a remote ridge trail, not far from where she and Miguel had made their fateful discovery. The bronze plaque was simple and elegant, mounted on a stone cairn that overlooked the vast expanse of the canyon. Tom had written the inscription. "Daniel Reeve, 1982 to 2024, environmental inspector," he warned us. "We just didn't listen." Below that, in smaller text, "His courage in the face of corruption saved countless lives and preserved this sacred landscape for future generations." Beth Martinez, now serving as the interim regional director for the National Park Service after her predecessor's arrest, spoke at the ceremony. "Daniel Reeve understood that some truths are worth dying for. Because of his sacrifice, and because of the brave people who refused to let his voice be silenced, the Grand Canyon remains protected from those who would exploit it for profit." The ravine where Lara and Miguel had found Daniel's evidence had been officially renamed Reeve's Cut on all Park Service maps. A small weatherproof information box had been installed near the plaque, containing copies of Daniel's journal and the story of how his evidence had exposed the Canyon Heights conspiracy. As the ceremony concluded and the small crowd began to disperse, Lara lingered by the plaque. From her backpack, she withdrew a weatherproof case containing her own copy of Daniel's journal, now preserved in archival plastic and accompanied by newspaper clippings documenting the investigation and arrests that had followed. She placed the case carefully in the information box, next to the other materials. Future hikers and climbers would find it there, along with a note she'd written. "For those who continue the fight for truth. Daniel's story doesn't end here." As she prepared to leave, Lara noticed something carved into the stone base of the cairn. Letters so subtle they were barely visible unless you knew where to look. Someone, perhaps Daniel himself during his final hike, had scratched a simple message into the red sandstone. "Truth echoes through stone." Standing there in the vast silence of the canyon, with the wind carrying the scent of sage and the distant call of a red-tailed hawk, Lara understood that Daniel Reeve had achieved something greater than he could have imagined. He had vanished into silence, but his truth would echo through these ancient stones forever. The canyon had kept its secrets for millions of years. But Daniel Reeves' secret, the truth that powerful people had finished to suppress, would never be buried again.